This video is a scientific method practice and review. We will remember and review how to write the question, how to write a proper hypothesis, and then we will take a practice problem and identify the independent variable, dependent variable, control variables, as well as use data to draw a conclusion and determine whether or not the conclusion is valid based on the experiment. First things first, the proper question format generally starts with how. You always need to include the IV and the DV. So how does the IV affect the DV? The really important things to include here are the IV. Affect is a very important word because that is what the experiment is going to do. How does the IV affect the DV? Hypothesis is written in much the same format, but you will do it in an if-then statement. If the IV, then the DV. It is very important to also include the IV and the DV, and your really important words are the if and then. If the IV, then the DV. Now let's take a practice problem. Farmer Joe wants to know the number of chicken eggs that will hatch will be different based on the amount of light the eggs will get each day. So first we want to just underline the given information. We have the number of chicken eggs that hatch. Is it going to be different based on the amount of light? And that's daily light. So the first thing we want to do is write a proper question. So, how does the IV affect the DV? That's going to help us determine what the IV and DV are. We want to determine, if I set up my experiment, I want to have 3 different things going on. And if I look back at my experiment, I want to know how many chicken eggs are going to hatch based on the amount of light. So what I want to change in the experiment is the amount of light the eggs get every day. So I'll set up my experiment and I'll say that this set of eggs is going to get 2 hours of light each day. This next set of eggs will get 6 hours of light each day. This final set of eggs is going to get 10 hours of light each day. So if I look at that, I'm going to say, my question will be, how does the amount of light affect the number of eggs hatched? Okay, that is my, how does my IV affect my DV? So how does the amount of light affect the number of eggs hatched? Right, now it's time to write our hypothesis. Here, I just want to draw a conclusion, decide what I think is going to be best here. In some experimental scenarios, the hypothesis will be given to you. It might say something like, Farmer Joe thinks that, and he'll choose one of those things. What I'm going to do is choose one myself. I think that the more hours of sunlight, or whatever kind of light we're using, that the eggs get, then the more eggs will hatch. So my hypothesis is going to start with my if, the IV, then the DV. So if the eggs get 10 hours, okay, there is my IV, then more will hatch. There's my DV. Right. As we continue practicing, you should have just watched a video earlier that reviewed what the independent or IV is. Independent variable is what changes in our experiment. And when we just looked at our hypothesis and our question, we decided that what's changing is the light. So one of our egg baskets or nests is going to get 2 hours. One of them will get 6 hours and the other will get 10 hours. So the hours of light that they receive each day is our IV. What is the dependent variable? In that video you also reviewed what the DV or the dependent variable is. The dependent variable is what changes as a result or in response to the IV. And in this particular case, the number of eggs that hatch is what responds to the independent variable. So more or less light will determine whether or not the eggs will hatch. Finally, we need to determine some of the controlled variables. If Farmer Joe places the eggs in all different places, in all different nests, or some eggs are chicken eggs and some eggs are duck eggs, then we could have a problem. So we have to have some controlled variables, or things that do not change in the experiment. In this particular experiment, we need to have the same type of nest for each of our different egg trials. We need to have the same type and amount of eggs. We can't have 12 eggs in one basket and 3 eggs in the other basket, because we will not be able to determine truly how many eggs would have hatched. We want to have them in the same location. We do not want to have one in the house and the other one outside in the cold. That would, of course, change our experiment. And another controlled variable that we want is the type of light that they're receiving. We don't want one of them to have sunlight, one of them to have one of these light bulbs, one of them to have candlelight. They all need to have exactly the same light, the same wattage, for different amounts of time each day. Otherwise, you have, just like the video previously said, too many things changing, and you wouldn't know what the result was. Now, what can we do to make sure that this is a valid experiment? For one thing, only one IV or one thing change. Everything else has to be constant. If we have too many things changing, then this experiment is not valid. Another thing, we need to have 3 to 5 trials. If we only do this experiment one time, we really can't be sure that this is actually valid. We need to have at least 3 to 5 trials to make sure this is a valid experiment. Finally, we draw a conclusion based on the results or the data that we've collected during the experiment. The conclusion should answer the question. And if you remember, how does the amount of light affect the number of eggs hatched? Can we draw a conclusion and answer that question based on the data we see here? If I look at this data, I see in trial 1, I have 2 hours of light per day, 4, 6 hours of light per day, 7 eggs, and 10 hours of light per day, 3 eggs. In trial 2, I have pretty similar results, and then again in trial 3, pretty similar results. What I can see here is that one of these trials, or one of these hours per day of light per day, has considerably more eggs hatched than the other 2. So my answer here, or my experimental conclusion, would be that 6 hours per day yields more eggs hatched. I sure hope this review helped. Now you can go on and answer the questions and the practice problems that you have on your EOC review.